This is the United States of America, for God's sake. We invest in people. We're in need.
Biden urges Congress to pass a nearly $2 trillion rescue package as Democrats squabble over the details.
Every source of power that the state of Texas has been compromised.
Power outages across the southern United States expose the failures of an aging infrastructure system as the debate over fossil fuels and renewable energy heats up. Hello and welcome to Inside America. I'm Ghida Fakhry. Just 1 month into his presidency, Joe Biden is rallying Congress and the American people behind a $1.9 trillion pandemic rescue package. For many, relief cannot come soon enough. The United States passed a tragic milestone this week, over 500,000 deaths from the coronavirus, which has also led to a 1-year drop in life expectancy. The vaccine rollout has so far reached 13% of Americans, with extreme weather conditions in Texas and other southern states delaying millions of vaccine doses as people struggled without power, food, or water. Nearly 7 in 10 Americans support Biden's plan to provide $1,400 checks to American families and billions of dollars in funding for schools and vaccines. Biden brushed aside warnings from critics who argue the package's price tag could result in inflation.
What would they have me cut? What would they have me leave out? Should we not invest $20 billion to vaccinate the nation?
Republicans call the package a payoff to progressives. With a vote in the House of Representatives expected later this week, Democrats are still divided over several key issues, including a proposal to raise the minimum wage from $7.25 to $15 an hour by 2025. Bernie Sanders, who chairs the Senate Budget Committee, says it is, quote, morally imperative to keep the $15 minimum wage in the relief package. But with the Senate split evenly between Republicans and Democrats, will the Democratic Party unite behind him? Joining me now is Stephanie Kelton, former chief economist on the U.S. Senate Budget Committee and senior economic advisor to Bernie Sanders' 2016 and 2020 presidential campaigns. She's also the author of the New York Times bestseller, The Deficit Myth. Stephanie Kelton, the $15 minimum wage is one of the most contentious issues in this relief package. Progressive have insisted on keeping it in. At least 2 Democrats in the Senate, though, say they will oppose this provision. Every Democratic senator will have to vote for this if it's going to pass, given the way the Senate is evenly split. You were the chief economist on the Senate Budget Committee in 2015, 2016. You've also advised Bernie Sanders, the current chairman of that committee. Is it a losing battle for him and the other progressives in the Democratic Party who want to keep this in? Will it survive in the Senate?
Look, I think that what I know for sure is that Senator Sanders wants the $15 an hour minimum wage in the package. That there is no question about that. So, yeah, I mean, you're right. There are 2 Democratic senators who have raised concerns. They are, prepared perhaps to create difficulties in allowing that to remain in part of the package. And so we'll see what happens. My instincts are this. I think that this all comes down to President Biden. And if President Biden genuinely wants the $15 an hour minimum wage as part of the COVID relief package, he will have an appropriate conversation with senators from Arizona and West Virginia, Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin, and he will let it be known that, listen, you guys got to do this for me, okay? We got to get this done. I want to see this in the legislation, and I think the votes would be there if he really wants to see it happen.
But is it the right time to press this, though? There are so many other pressing issues facing Congress, which, it is true, hasn't raised the minimum wage in more than a decade. But a report that was released just this month by the Congressional Budget Office found that raising the minimum wage would increase the federal deficit over the next 10 years. While it would lift 900,000 people out of poverty, it would cost 1.4 million jobs. A double-edged sword?
Well, I think there are a number of problems with the CBO analysis, and a number of economists have already written at length about what those problems are. I don't think we probably have time to get into the sort of economics behind it and why I think that the CBO report is problematic in a number of ways. But the bottom line is the impact on the budget is not what's important. What's important, I believe, is delivering on a pledge that the Democratic Party has made to voters who elected them and put them in charge of the House, the Senate, and the White House. The Democrats ran on this. President Biden ran on $15 an hour minimum wage. The Democratic Party put it in their party platform. They affirmed that this is a core value of the Democratic Party. This is the opportunity to do that. And I'm not sure that you get a second chance at this. I think now is the moment to do it. It's being phased in gradually. So, we're not talking about going to $15 an hour overnight or next year. This is a gradual increase in the federal minimum wage that would get us to 15 by 2025. If anything, it's not ambitious enough in my view, but I do think that Democrats have to deliver on their promises.
But you say the impact on the budget isn't important, but with the US national debt today at more than $27 trillion, and borrowing is expected to grow. Is it wise economic policy to add to the federal deficit? And just how sustainable is it for the US to keep growing its debt with China holding 15% of the US Treasury bills, notes, and bonds held by any foreign government, 1 trillion out of 7 trillion? Just how sustainable is it for the US to keep borrowing?
It's perfectly sustainable. So the problem is that people tend to think of the government's finances as akin to their own personal finances. So when we hear words like borrowing and debt, we think of what we do, right? As individuals, as households. When we borrow, we think of our credit card. We think of debts mounting. Maybe we have, car payments, student loan debt, a mortgage. We think debt and, oh, how am I going to pay back all this debt? The federal government is fundamentally different. Its budget works differently from ours. It's the issuer of the currency. The rest of us are currency users. So the reality is that every deficit is good for someone because the deficit is just the difference between two numbers. That is literally what the government deficit is. One number is how many dollars the government spends into the economy each year. The other number is how many dollars they subtract back out, mostly through taxation. So a government deficit means that they add more than they subtract. So every deficit is good for someone because the government's deficits are financial contributions to some other part of the economy. The question is, for whom and for what purpose? Who is the beneficiary of those financial contributions that the government's deficit makes? And are they making real investments in the economy? Are they delivering for the American people? And with this $1.9 trillion COVID package, they're going to do enormous good for people in this economy compared to the $1.9 trillion that Republicans added to the deficit through their tax cuts in 2017. Those tax cuts were a windfall for people who were largely already doing phenomenally well. This time, the deficit is being used to deliver for people who are really struggling in our economy.
All right, Stephanie Kelton, great to have you on the program. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Now, while Democrats in Congress push through their relief package, there are looming divisions over another more costly plan, a $4 trillion infrastructure and clean energy investment bill. With many states still reeling from massive winter storms and extreme weather conditions that left millions of people without access to heat, water, and electricity for days, and more than 70 people dead, discussion has shifted to the next big spending bill. While Democrats are largely united behind the goal of combating climate change and addressing the country's crumbling infrastructure, they are likely to face fierce opposition from Republican lawmakers. The Republican governor of Texas, Greg Abbott, refused to pin the blame for the energy crisis in his state on the deregulated, privatized energy sector in Texas or its fossil fuel industry, instead blaming it on climate change legislation proposed by progressive Democrats.
This shows how the Green New Deal would be a deadly deal for the United States of America. It just shows that fossil fuel is necessary for the state of Texas as well as other states.
While solar energy and wind turbines froze during the snowstorm, the low temperatures were cold enough to freeze oil and gas liquids as well. Texas leads the United States in energy production. It produces more wind energy than any other state, and its solar energy capacity is growing rapidly, with renewable energy sources accounting for nearly 1/5 of the net electricity generated in Texas. The state uses more energy than any other state and accounts for almost 1/7 of the total US consumption. So how could a state like Texas, which produces more electricity than any other state and has more than 1/4 of the nation's proven natural gas reserves, end up in a crisis like this? I'm joined by Stephen Chu, US Secretary of Energy under President Barack Obama, Nobel Prize-winning physicist and professor of physics and molecular and cellular physiology at Stanford University. Secretary Chu, Texas is regarded as the energy powerhouse of the United States. How did it get to this?
Well, it has to do with the way they chose to operate their distribution system and their energy system. They wanted independence from the federal government, and they wanted a market structure. And so in this market structure, it's difficult to plan a purely market structure and yet still allow for fairly rare contingencies once every 10, 20, 30 years.
You say Texas wanted independence, and it is the only state in the United States, along with Hawaii and Alaska, to have a standalone electrical grid that is isolated from the rest of the country. But does this crisis then show the failures of a deregulated, independent energy sector with no federal oversight or accountability? I mean, can Texas continue to stay outside the national grid?
Well, I think what they need to do now is to say, can we be part of the national grid, still have a market sort of based energy, and yet still have that market allow for these events, these catastrophic events, which unfortunately the prediction is they're going to become more frequent. And so in unity, there is actually strength. And so if a particular sector of the United States loses power, then you can get power from other parts of the United States. And so this transmission and grid system actually gives you assurance of continuity.
But Texans, as you know, pride themselves for their individualism, for their independent streak. In fact, one of your successors as Energy Secretary, Rick Perry, warned against the federal government getting involved in any way to regulate the energy sector. He said Texans would be, quote, without electricity for 3 days to keep the federal government out of their business. Can private companies, though, private companies driven by profit making and often without any sort of accountability, can they be in charge of national power grids? Can they take on the role of government?
Well, so far it has not proven to be the case, for sure. And also experience has shown that if there are rare events, and the classic one would be things in which, well, climate change is the ultimate rare event, where it's off in the future, most of it is off in the future, although we're seeing a lot of the effects today. And so do you actually spend money now to give resilience and insurance of something that might happen 10 years from today? And so in a free market system, you're saying, well, no, we can have cheaper prices. And oh, yes, once in a while you lose 3 days, 4 days, a week of power. But now you can also say, what's the big deal? The big deal is that there is a lot of suffering and people have died.
Yes, and a lot of politicians used to say, what's the big deal, especially in a state like Texas? Why invest in preventing something that is so unlikely to happen? But the governor of Texas also blamed the state's problems on the environmental policies pushed by liberals. Does this crisis, though, actually make the case for a Green New Deal to combat climate change and to modernize the energy infrastructure?
It certainly makes a case for having an interconnected grid. Now, the blame of, let's say, wind power on this it doesn't hold any water if you look at the facts. Yes, wind power dropped, but most of the drop was due to the traditional forms of energy, coal and natural gas. And that lion's share of what was lost was in these more traditional supplies of energy.
But do you believe that the Green New Deal is the right way forward?
I do believe I believe in renewable energy and interconnected grid. I do believe in resiliency, so you still need power backup until energy storage at a grand scale and a several week scale becomes commonplace and affordable. And that storage will be actually do one of two things. It's power on demand. It's going to either be natural gas or nuclear. And I, for one, have been arguing that you want to keep nuclear alive, especially the existing nuclear reactors, and just some outlive their natural lifetimes. But the solar and wind is getting cheaper and cheaper. You need an extensive solar and grid system. And I see a lowering of energy prices, especially if you can ship energy over longer distances. The average cost of energy, once you have long distance transmission and effective grid system, will go down, not up.
How do you convince energy companies and the lawmakers who depend on their financial contributions to invest in renewable energy, to upgrade their infrastructure in states that don't often go through these types of extreme weather conditions, or who don't believe in climate change?
Well, first, I agree that if you spend money, a little bit of money spent now wisely, instead of spending money to pick up the pieces after weather climate disasters, the floods, the hurricanes, the forest fires in the West have been catastrophic in terms of costs, the cost in human suffering, cost in lives, cost of everything. And so money wisely spent today, it will actually mitigate a lot of those risks as we go into the future. But I also maintain that money wisely spent today will ultimately bring the cost of energy down further, which is what most Americans want, but in a clean way, in a carbon-free way.
But isn't this all a bit more complicated as a former politician yourself? Do you believe that a structural change in politics is also needed to ensure that politicians aren't controlled by big money, by special interest groups, by fossil fuel lobbyists and climate deniers? Or is this simply wishful thinking?
Well, as with anything, when there's change, the incumbents, the established people, rule the roost in a certain sense because they're the big business. And as the upstarts begin to emerge, how is it that you allow better solutions to emerge, given that the incumbents want to protect their turf? Ultimately, this is going to be a concerted effort and an educational effort to the American voters. In the last analysis, we live in a democracy, and the voters have to be convinced that it is in their best interest, both economically, environmentally, for themselves, their children, their grandchildren, that this is the best way forward.
All right, Secretary Stephen Chu, great to have your perspective. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So while Republicans are largely laying the blame for the Texas blackout on renewable energy, environmentalists are calling this a wake-up call for America's reliance on fossil fuel. While Joe Biden has committed to transitioning to net zero emissions by 2050, he has cancelled the permit for the Keystone Pipeline on his first day in office and signed an executive order pausing new oil and gas leases on federal land. But oil and gas pipelines continue to snake across the country. The Enbridge Line 3 pipeline is said to carry 1 million barrels of tar sands a day from Alberta, Canada, across North Dakota, Minnesota, and Wisconsin. It crosses tribal land that Native Americans say is protected by treaties between the United States government and the Ojibwe nations. Over 100 activists protesting against the pipeline have been arrested. They're known as water protectors. One of those environmental activists is Winona LaDuke of the Ojibwe White Earth Nation in Minnesota. She is program director of Honor the Earth and a two-time vice presidential candidate with Ralph Nader for the Green Party. Winona LaDuke, with much of this Line 3 pipeline going through tribal lands, what impact is it having on your community?
It's really devastating. I mean, they're cutting through the heart of our wild rice territory. And wild rice is the only place in the world that grows, is where we live. And, you know, already a bunch of it's been destroyed by the state of Minnesota, but this pipeline hits the heartland and impacts 220 different areas where wild rice will be, all these watersheds, you know. So it's also just tearing us through the middle of our communities. It's these giant buncher fellers are coming in and cutting things down and throwing them trees and just cutting this swath of destruction. It's really traumatic. It's really traumatic. And our people have been up there and 100 people have been arrested so far. You know, I'm just saying, like, to start with, this is a really devastating pipeline. You know, it's really devastating.
You say it's had a devastating impact, yet a federal judge ruled earlier this month that the construction could go on, saying that the plaintiffs, yourself and other plaintiffs, the protesters, failed to show that they will suffer irreparable harm as a result of this pipeline. There would be environmental damage, the judge said, but delaying the pipeline could actually present its own safety risks. What do you say to that?
Well, first of all, that judge has no idea what's going on in northern Minnesota. And, unfortunately, the courts don't see, what the judge saw was that there's no oil yet. And so climate change isn't going to happen and oil spills aren't going to happen, but nothing to do with the amount of devastation that is occurring on the ground now, the militarization of northern Minnesota and the number of arrests. It is devastating to our people. So the judge was wrong. We still face the company in court. And when we face them in court, what we pointed out is that there was no federal environmental impact statement. Our tribe and the Red Lake Band, we have refused any settlements and we continue to sue them because what we want is our water and our rice. We don't want their money. And Enbridge has told the state of Minnesota that their other pipe is going to break. Turns out that the pipe that they're trying to replace, they just want to run it bigger. They have to run it at a low capacity because it is a dangerous pipe, but it's fine at the capacity it's at. It hasn't had any spills. New pipes actually do spill. That's what we saw with the Keystone XL, which within just a couple of years of its operation on the initial stages of it, the rest, of course, did not get permitted. They had a spill of 400,000 gallons, and that was a new pipe.
And that's,
no pipe is better than a new pipe.
And that's a pipeline that President Biden put a stop to on day one of his presidency. He now says he is committed to environmental justice. He is creating an environmental justice office within the Department of Justice. He also nominated the first Native American, Deb Haaland, a congresswoman from New Mexico, to be Secretary of the Interior. She would be the first Native American to lead a cabinet agency. She'll be responsible for the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the U.S.'s natural resources and parks as well. She said this at her confirmation hearings just this week.
As I've learned in this role, there's no question that fossil energy does and will continue to play a major role in America for years to come. I know how important oil and gas revenues are to critical services, but we must also recognize that the energy industry is innovating, and our climate challenge must be addressed.
She does have a fine line to walk. How much of a tough balancing act will she have, and what would she bring to the job as the first Native American?
Well, first, she brings to the job that she comes from a community that was subjected to oil and gas, in this case, uranium leases, leaving a big hole in the village that she's from at Laguna Pueblo. So she knows what mismanagement of trust resources is like from the Department of Interior. She also knows that at this moment in time, the economies are changing. I mean, the richest guys in the world aren't from Exxon, they're from Tesla and Amazon. So interesting time to be at the helm of a big agency, and I know fully that she will do this job well.
But as you know, she's also facing fierce opposition to her position on oil and gas drilling on public lands, opposition from Republican lawmakers, some of whom have called her a radical for wanting to stop some of the drilling that goes on, saying that it will cost thousands of jobs and harm the economy in the west of the country. Her own state, New Mexico, is heavily dependent on oil and gas. Can she really take on these powerful groups and not do damage to the economy and cut jobs when people need them?
She doesn't really need to take on those groups because that economy is the last century's playbook. The fact is that disruptive technologies like electric cars, solar energy, and the internet have replaced a lot of the need for fossil fuels. And as I said, the largest company in the world is no longer Exxon. It's Tesla and Amazon. Those are the richest guys out there. And so what we are seeing is a massive transition from fossil fuels cars to electric cars. That's the time that she's going to be in office. And so her decisions have also been made by industry, where industry is transforming.
Winona LeDuc, great talking to you. Thank you so much for being with us.
Miigwech, thank you.
As is all too often the case, minorities and historically marginalized communities in the US bear the brunt of the country's environmental, health, and economic crises. In Texas, the Latino, Black, Indigenous, and Asian communities, who represent 17 million people and account for 60% of the state's population, were hit particularly hard by the recent blackouts. Their neighborhoods were the first to face power outages and will likely be among the last to recover. The state's failing power system exposed once again not just the deep-rooted racial inequalities in America, but also the pervasive disconnect and hypocrisy of a political system that props up local officials and lawmakers more beholden to their corporate donors than their constituents. And while the White House tries to assert its own authority in a federalist system, it is also engaged in a delicate balancing act with competing political and socio-economic pressures. On one end, progressives calling for investments in renewable energy and a crumbling infrastructure system, calling for policies rooted in environmental justice. On the other, conservatives fighting to maintain the status quo and their free market winner-takes-all capitalist ideology. And so, in short, with barely a month into the start of his administration, President Biden knows the US, which he said was so far behind the curve, needs to invest in its own infrastructure to be competitive in the 21st century. The world's wealthiest nation has few good options for now, but to keep spending and borrowing its way out of its crises. That's all from me, Ghida Fakhry. Let us know what you think. From the entire team in Washington, thanks for watching.